Hello everybody. Today I'm going to be starting a three-part series on how we can use smart objects to have a more efficient and flexible workflow within our interiors and architectural photography. So we will not be editing this beautiful plate of some kind of meat. I have to apologize, I'm a vegetarian, so I don't even know what kind of meat cut that is, but I know how to take pretty pictures of food. So let's start. Let me just put on a filter here for us. So the idea here is that we can use smart objects in various ways to have a better, more efficient, more flexible workflow. So whenever I work with photos in Photoshop, the first thing I'll always do, here I have a series of photos. We have my bracketed exposure, -2, 0, +2, and one flash exposure in case I need it to have a bit more better contrast. So the first thing I'll always do is I'll go into my grid view and I will click the right button on my mouse and edit in, open a smart object in Photoshop. There's a few little tricky things here. If I am in my develop mode or if I'm in the loop mode, if I click on the right button and go edit in, open a smart object, it'll only open as a smart object the photo that I'm seeing in the loop view or in the develop view. If I want to open multiple files as smart objects, I have to be in the grid view and I have to have the photo selected. So that's a little tricky thing. I always, by mistake, I'm in the develop, I choose all the photos and I right button, edit in, open as smart objects, and it only opens up one photo. You can also go here in photo in the menu, edit in, open a smart object. Now everything has a good side and everything has a bad side. The bad side about opening photos in Photoshop as smart objects is that you can't automatically stack them. It's not like when you just open as normal files, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. You cannot open up multiple files as layers using smart objects. So unfortunately that means that you have to come over to Photoshop, which I've already done, and you have to manually stack these photos. Now you can see all the photos, they have this little symbol here that indicates that they are smart objects. So that's how we know that they've opened up as smart objects. So I'll show you a few different use cases of how I use smart objects in Photoshop with my interiors photos. So here I'm going to add black masks to my flash file and my bracketed exposure. So I'm just going to alt click on the mask symbol, and then I'm going to alt click on the mask and just push it up to copy the mask to the other layers. So what happens when I'm in Lightroom? Sometimes I can't really visualize how these exposures are going to blend together and how to best use them to blend together. So what happens is I'm going to come back to Photoshop. I'm going to create luminance masks. I use an action that I picked up on the internet from OH luminance masks, but any luminance mask action will work fine. So I'm just going to give myself a play here. You'll notice I use actions for everything because I'm lazy and I don't want to do I don't like multiple steps. So here we have our actions already set. I'm going to choose a brights. This brights 4 looks pretty good. And I'm going to brush that in with a white brush. There we go. I'm going to lower my flow a bit around 8. Increase the size of my brush. And just brush that in nice and slowly. Perfect. Now, how can we use smart objects within Photoshop to have a more flexible and efficient workflow? The cool thing about smart objects is that if I open up a file from Lightroom into Photoshop as a smart object, what can I do? If I need to do any adjustments to make my dark exposure blend better with my light exposure, I can always click 2 times on the smart object. And what will happen is it will open up Adobe Camera Raw. So now I can work on the raw file to make it blend better with the other exposure. Because when I'm in Lightroom, I'm not always sure how well these are going to blend together, what I can do to make them blend together. So So in this case, I'm going to bump up my shadows quite a bit, my blacks as well. This will obviously increase the amount of noise in my file, so I'm going to come here in detail. I'm going to pump up that noise reduction to about 30. And here I'll come into my curve. I'll bump up the shadows and the darks a bit as well. This will make it. Now I'm also going to come into my basic and just bring down that highlight a bit. I also like to give it a bit of texture. So now what I've done is I've taken my dark exposure, I've lifted up all my shadows so that it'll blend more seamlessly with my base exposure. Now you can see, that's giving me a bit of a better blend. Another thing I'll always do, I like to give, since this exposure blending, since this luminance mask is quite chiseled, and it doesn't really give me those nice gradients from highlights to my midtones, I'll like to give it a bit of a blur. So normally when I use luminance masks, I'll give it a 300 pixel blur. So that makes it so it just, actually I'll give it a bit more, one more 300 pixel blur. Here, instead of going into filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and putting in a value, I have just a bunch of actions with different values, remembering that when I use luminance masks, the values blur I'm going to use are normally above 150. More than 400, there's no real reason to use it. So another cool thing I can do, let's say, I forgot to color correct this blue area here. That's fine. I can just click 2 times on my base exposure. Come in here, grab a quick luminance, not a luminance mask, sorry. I'm going to use my color range. I'm going to select that area. Y to take off my show overlay. I'm just going to correct that, giving a bit more yellow and a bit of magenta, no, a bit of green. And then I'm going to intersect that. I'm going to press shift, sorry, I'm used to saying shift in Portuguese. Give me a brush, and then I'm just going to press Y, just paint that area in a bit to get rid of those blues that I don't want. Here actually I'm going to go into color range, and I'm going to reduce the amount of blue that I'm going to be affecting. Perfect. So resolve that. I'll probably have to do this with my shadow layer as well, but we'll get there. Another great thing I can do as well, it's not the case here, but if I want, I can come to my smart object, I can right click on it, and I can make a new smart object via copy. That makes it so that this is pretty much the same thing as a virtual copy in Lightroom. Now I can independently, with the same file, come here. I can do another type of editing to this photo, independent of the original smart object, and then I can blend these two via masks as well. So sometimes you might have 2 very different white balances that you have to equal out, so you can make one file with one white balance, make a new smart object via copy, and have another white balance for that second one, and then mix them together with masks. So in this case, I don't need to do that. So I'll just throw out this one. Now we'll work on my shadows. I'll come down to my darks. Let's see what darks. Yeah, that one looks good. I'll control click on the alpha channel. Come back to my RGB. And then I'm going to come here with a very large brush, white, flow of around 8%. Just brush in those shadows that I want. Now you see it's getting very funky with very low contrast, which is not what I want, because I forgot to do something in Lightroom, but perfect. I'm working with smart objects. That's not a problem. So what I can do is click twice on my smart object here for my shadow layer. I'll just bring down those highlights a bit. Actually, I'll bring down the exposure a tad as well. And I can come here to my curves where I'm going to be adding my contrast, take my shadows, bring them down. Oops. I have to leave my markers on. Bring those shadows down. So what this is doing is now I have shadows that are nice and bright, but they don't lack contrast. Perfect. I'm going to color correct that area I'd spoken about as well. So range. I should have done this in Lightroom because that would have been much easier. Would have been just a quick synchronization, but it happens. I'll refine that to around 30, around 40. Press Y. Just bring that up a bit, my yellows, and then intersect that with a brush. Perfect. There we go. Now, okay. Now we'll see that my exposure blend is quite a bit better because I brought down those shadows and have a nice contrast. Look at that. Nice shadows. Nice contrasty shadows. And I'm also going to give a blur about 350 here in my shadows. Control 0. Perfect. So actually there's one thing I didn't want here. Since I'm working on this file, I'm just going to press W and go into rectangle. Just select. I don't want to bring up the shadows of my TV. Neither do I want to bring up the shadows of my lamp here. So I'm just going to come with a black brush and block that out here quickly. There we go. That's done. Control D. I'm going to choose my TV here. I'm just going to use a quick pen tool. Since it's a square, work faster than using the quick selection, object selection tool. Selection, feather radius, okay. And just since my foreground color is black, I'm going to press Alt Delete. That'll fill the foreground with black. Perfect. I'm actually going to go my dark layer here and just brush in this region. Whoops. Right. Brush in that region just a bit to get rid of that reflection. Since I'm probably going to be doing a bit more work on this TV in terms of maybe painting in that area, I'm going to save this selection as a curve. Remember, a mask is a selection is a mask. So I can always control click on a mask, make it into a selection, or I can always have a selection active and transform it into a mask via any of the localized, adjustment layers. So a mask is a selection and a selection is a mask. So this is the first part showing you how we can use smart objects to have a more efficient workflow in Photoshop. Because as soon as I open up any file from Lightroom into Photoshop as a smart object, it gives me the ability to open up that file in Adobe Camera Raw while in Photoshop. So if there's some mistake that I did on the raw file, I don't have to go back into Lightroom, rework that raw file, and bring it back to Photoshop. I can do everything within Photoshop that I need. So that's the first part of how we can use smart objects to have a more efficient and more flexible workflow, which are always the two most important things when we talk about non-destructive editing. I hope that this tutorial helps you out. Give it a try. If you have any comments or suggestions, please feel free to write in the comments. And I hope you guys have a great time shooting photos of architecture interiors, doing what we love, and having a good time. Hope you have a good day, a good afternoon, and a good night.